Script editor. A person in television who has all the lack of power of a writer and all the headaches of a producer. Between the radio series and the novels of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there was Doctor Who. Season 17 was the season of Douglas Adams, for good and for bad. He really pushed to steer things his way behind the scenes. A larger budget, more work to get things in agreement with what the writers were doing, and bringing in experienced science fiction writers with creative ideas. But Douglas' comedic influence combined with the fact that Tom Baker, now in his 6th year in the role and seen as simultaneously indispensable and insufferable, and wanting to do more comedy, led to this being a far different kind of Doctor Who than the one that Douglas had submitted rejected scripts to just a few years earlier. Douglas decided to reserve the final story of that season for himself, the 6-parter, which was no surprise because he'd been irritated by the problems of trying to fit the pirate planet into a 4-parter. But the rest was to simply be him doing script editing. Or so he thought. It started with The Destiny of the Daleks, which would come from Terry Nation himself, a sort of sequel to Genesis of the Daleks. Douglas' fingerprints were all over this one, and he later said, while not naming names, that he had to effectively write one script this season because the nameless writer turned in some explosions and a couple corridor scenes and told Douglas to fill in the rest. Aside of the fact that there's some absolutely silly stuff in here, such as Romana's regeneration scene, and even a shout-out to Hitchhikers, there's not much to see of Douglas in this. It was more of a case of plastering over someone else's work than doing anything himself. But at least that was done, and he could move on to the second story, which he wouldn't have to write. Or so he thought. Things took a wrong turn with one of 2 stories commissioned from David Fisher. Well, I suppose you could say a wrong turn with both, since the second one was Creature from the Pit, the worst story of Tom Baker's run. But his other one, The Gamble with Time, had a problem. Williams wanted some changes made, including moving the location of the story to Paris, but Fisher couldn't change it. The reason the script was a shambles was because his family life was rapidly deteriorating, so Douglas was dragged in on a Friday to Williams' place, and the two spent the weekend trying to rewrite this disaster of a script into something filmable. The result of that effort was The City of Death, which is considered one of the best episodes in the show's history. The City of Death was a simple investigation into art theft that leads to the revelation that all of human advancement is thanks to one alien being who in primordial times made a mistake that doomed his race but kicked off life on Earth. The alien is temporally fragmented, living in numerous periods throughout Earth's history, trying to push their development so the one in the last era could have the technology to go back and prevent himself from making that mistake in the first place, the one that doomed his people, but in so doing, preventing all life on Earth from ever existing. The story showed a unique opportunity, at once being the Doctor thrust into the world of hard-boiled detective stories, and the hard-boiled detective thrust into the world of the Doctor. And Douglas' experience with comedy skits played that well, without going overboard, allowing the humor to complement rather than dominate the affair. It also allowed him a chance to again meet with his idol, John Cleese, who was free to do a cameo as an art patron. But while the story was a triumph, it also was obviously not a Douglas Adams story. By which I mean, there is much less of the big science fiction ideas that Douglas liked to use, with more of an emphasis on the mystery taking place. It's perhaps because of the circumstances, though, that it's the reason for the episode's success. It was written by an experienced Douglas Adams and not reworked by anyone, so it had the right mix of comedy and drama. The Pirate Planet had the comedy played up a bit more than the script had actually indicated. But he was also forced to keep things more focused, only having a couple of the big ideas instead of loads of them that could get things a bit tangled up for Doctor Who. That resulted in a story that was tight, funny, exciting, and clever. The end of season 17, though, that was to finally be his chance. It was to be The Cricket Men. Tom Baker actually liked it. In fact, when there was interest in a Doctor Who movie, he and Douglas tried to get them to pick up The Cricket Men. But Williams kept rejecting that story. It was too much like self-parody, he said. So Douglas was forced to quickly squeak out a story that would become known as Shada, about an aged Time Lord and friend of the Doctor who is at Cambridge, but is in reality a criminal who had escaped from the Time Lord prison of Shada, although he really was just living a quiet retirement and no longer the villain that he had once been. The real villain was someone else wanting the power of this great criminal with grand aspirations of implanting his mind into everyone, allowing the Doctor to continue his trend of mocking universal domination. It's a troublesome place, difficult to administer, and as a piece of real estate, it's virtually worthless because by definition there'd be no one to sell it to. But the villain's plan is that the universe would be him. Shada is famous because it was the incomplete story. There was the industrial action going on, and they were never able to finish it, which Douglas himself figures is the reason it's popular. Had it been filmed, the flaws would have been apparent, he reasoned. Shada does indeed feel a bit weaker than City of Death, no doubt because the greater length allows it to meander a bit and redo gags. Douglas' best work was stuff that he would agonize over, and Shada didn't really allow for that, so although it is a better story than he gives it credit for, it was still nevertheless deficient. While City of Death had been cooked up in even less time, that had ideas in place to start with and a demand to be a certain length, forcing Douglas to keep things more focused and consequently make his big ideas look even bigger. With Shada, neither of those were in play, so on the one hand, he had more freedom and time than City, but not enough that he could properly massage the material to make the best use of his ideas. But the ideas he cooked up in both these stories percolated and eventually would come together with entirely new ones that we'll be looking at tomorrow.